Hey everyone, welcome back to tonight's journey into the past. Before we begin, drop your city and current time in the comments below. It's always amazing to see where our community spans across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on that fan for some gentle background sound, and let's step together into a world where winter doesn't just visit, it conquers everything. You wake up and your breath forms ice crystals before it even leaves your mouth. That's your first clue that today is going to be exactly like yesterday, a battle against a landscape that wants you dead. Welcome to Greenland in the year 1002, where Erik the Red has convinced 1,000 Vikings that this frozen wasteland is actually green, fertile and perfect for farming. Spoiler alert, it isn't. Your bed is a pile of sealskins stacked on wooden planks, and somehow you're still cold enough to see your own breath inside your own house. The walls are built from stones and turf held together with whale oil and hope. Outside, the wind doesn't whisper. It screams like a banshee that's been personally offended by your existence. The temperature hasn't risen above freezing in 4 months, and honestly, it's starting to take this whole winter thing personally. You roll over and immediately regret it. Your muscles have turned into frozen rope, and every joint protests like you've been sleeping on a pile of rocks, which, considering the quality of Viking furniture, you basically have. The fur blanket that's supposed to keep you warm smells like it died recently and might still be planning its revenge. But here's the thing about Greenland mornings. There's no snooze button, no gentle wake-up call, no coffee brewing in the distance. There's just survival. And if you don't start moving soon, the cold will start making decisions for you. Decisions like whether your toes are really essential, or if frostbite might be an interesting new fashion statement. You sit up and your spine makes sounds like breaking icicles. Congratulations. You've successfully transitioned from horizontal freezing to vertical freezing. Progress. Around you, the longhouse is stirring. Other Vikings are emerging from their own fur cocoons, looking about as enthusiastic as you feel, which is to say, not at all. Someone has already started working on the fire pit in the centre of the room. Not because they're particularly motivated, but because the alternative is becoming a Viking popsicle. The smoke rises toward a hole in the roof, though most of it seems to enjoy taking scenic detours through your lungs first. You cough, and somehow even that manages to create more ice crystals. The person next to you, let's call her Astrid because everyone was either named Erik, Olaf, or Astrid, is already wrapping herself in layers of wool and fur that make her look like a very large, very grumpy sheep. She doesn't say good morning because good mornings don't exist here. There are only mornings you survive. You attempt to put on your boots, which have frozen solid overnight despite being inside. It's like trying to shove your feet into stone blocks that happen to be shaped like footwear. The leather is so stiff it could probably be used as armour. And honestly, given where you are, it might need to be. Outside you can hear the sound of ice cracking, wind howling, and someone arguing with what sounds like a very stubborn goat. Just another typical Greenland morning where the weather has 2 settings. Deadly cold and slightly less deadly cold. But you're about to discover that getting dressed is the easy part. Because now you need to step outside into a world where the air itself is trying to kill you, and figure out how to not just survive the day, but actually accomplish something useful. Like finding food that isn't frozen solid, or water that isn't basically ice with delusions of being liquid. You take a deep breath of the smoky, cold air inside the longhouse. It tastes like seal fat, unwashed Vikings, and regret. But it's warm regret, which makes it practically luxurious by Greenland standards. In about 60 seconds, you're going to step outside and remember what actual cold feels like. The fire crackles, someone's stomach rumbles loud enough to wake the dead, and somewhere in the distance a seal is probably having the last laugh. Because here in Greenland, the wildlife is winning, the weather is always angry, and you're about to learn exactly why Vikings eventually decided that maybe, just maybe, they should have listened when people said this place was uninhabitable. You push open the door of the longhouse and immediately understand why Vikings believed in so many gods of war and death. Because this landscape is clearly where they come to practice. The wind hits you like a physical punch, carrying ice crystals sharp enough to cut glass and cold enough to freeze your tears before they can properly form. Welcome to the Greenland that Erik the Red somehow convinced people was habitable. You're standing on what he claimed was green pasture land. It's not green, it's white. Aggressively, blindingly, endlessly white. The snow doesn't fall gently here like in some romantic Christmas carol. It attacks horizontally, driven by winds that seem to have a personal vendetta against exposed skin. The temperature this morning is approximately -20 degrees Fahrenheit, which translates to your breath freezes and falls to the ground like tiny ice marbles. You watch this happen and realise that even your exhalations are giving up on trying to stay warm. If your own breath can't handle this place, what chance do you have? In the distance, you can see the shapes of other buildings, more longhouses, storage sheds, and what might be a workshop if it wasn't buried under 4 feet of snow. The entire settlement looks like it's slowly being consumed by winter itself, as if the landscape is actively trying to digest these humans, structures, and return them to the frozen earth. Your feet crunch through snow so deep that with each step you disappear up to your knees. It's not the powdery, playful snow you might remember from childhood. This is concrete snow. Snow with opinions, snow that grabs your boots and holds on like it's personally offended that you're trying to walk across its territory. Behind you, other Vikings are emerging from their longhouses, each one wrapped in so many layers of fur and wool that they look less like humans and more like walking carpet samples. Nobody speaks, not because there's nothing to say, but because opening your mouth long enough to form words means inviting the cold inside, where it will set up permanent residence in your lungs. The landscape stretches out in every direction, an endless expanse of white broken only by dark patches of exposed rock that look like wounds in the snow. These aren't rolling hills or gentle valleys. This is terrain that was clearly designed by someone with a very dark sense of humour and a complete lack of sympathy for human comfort. To your left you can see the fjord where the longships are moored, though moored might be optimistic. They are frozen into the ice like ancient artefacts trapped in amber. The water, if you can still call it water when it's been solid for months, stretches away toward the horizon, where it meets a sky the colour of old pewter. The sun, when it bothers to appear at all, sits low on the horizon like it's too tired to climb higher. It provides light, but no warmth, like a cosmic practical joke. It's the kind of sun that makes you understand why ancient cultures invented seasonal depression, and why Vikings spent so much time inventing increasingly creative gods to blame for weather. You start walking toward what you hope is the food storage shed, each step a small victory against a landscape that clearly prefers its humans frozen. The snow squeaks under your boots with a sound like stepping on mice. If mice were made of ice and harboured deep grudges against footwear. Someone has managed to keep a path partially clear between buildings, though clear is relative when you're still ankle-deep in snow that crunches like broken glass. You follow this path, grateful for whoever did the work, while silently cursing Erik the Red and his wildly optimistic marketing campaign about Greenland's agricultural potential. The air is so cold it has texture. It scrapes against your face like sandpaper made of frozen regret. Your nose has already gone numb, which is probably a mercy because the alternative would be feeling every molecule of cold air as it invades your sinuses and sets up an ice sculpture in your nasal cavity. But here's what Erik the Red didn't mention in his sales pitch. This isn't just cold weather. This is cold with personality, cold with agenda, cold that seems to take personal satisfaction in finding every gap in your clothing, every exposed inch of skin, every moment when you think you might actually be warm enough. You're about to discover that everything here, from finding breakfast to not dying before lunch, requires a level of planning, preparation, and sheer stubborn determination that would make modern survival experts weep into their GPS devices. The storage shed is a low, squat building that's been almost completely swallowed by snowdrifts. You can see the outline of a door, but it's buried behind what looks like a small mountain of snow that's been accumulating since approximately the dawn of time. This is your first lesson in Greenland architecture. Buildings here aren't built on the landscape, they're built despite the landscape, and the landscape is winning. You grab what might be a shovel, it's hard to tell under the ice, and start digging. Each scoop of snow is heavier than it looks, packed dense with weeks of wind and cold that have turned what should be light, fluffy precipitation into something with the density and cooperativeness of concrete. Your breath comes out in great white puffs that immediately freeze into tiny ice crystals and fall to the ground like the world's least helpful snow globe. After 10 minutes of digging, you've managed to clear about 6 inches of progress. At this rate, you'll reach the door sometime next spring, assuming you don't freeze to death first or get buried by the snow that's already starting to blow back into the hole you're digging. It's like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup if the ocean was made of ice, and had strong opinions about staying exactly where it was. A fellow Viking appears beside you, carrying what might be the world's first snow shovel. though it looks more like someone strapped a flat board to the end of a stick and hoped for the best. Together, you attack the snowdrift with the determination of people who really want to eat something that isn't frozen solid. The digging is exhausting work. Your muscles generate heat, which is good, but the sweat immediately starts to freeze against your skin, which is less good. It's like your body is creating its own personal ice sculpture, one drop of perspiration at a time. You're simultaneously overheating from exertion and freezing to death from exposure, which seems like the kind of cruel irony that Greenland specialises in. Finally, after what feels like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, you reach the door. It's frozen shut, of course, because nothing in Greenland is allowed to be simple. The wood has contracted in the cold, the metal hinges have frozen solid, and the entire structure is held in place by ice that seems to have formed with the specific purpose of keeping you away from food. Your companion produces a small axe and begins carefully chipping away at the ice around the doorframe. This is delicate work. Too gentle and you'll be here until the next ice age. Too aggressive and you'll break the door, leaving the food storage. Exposed to the elements and turning your winter survival situation into a winter suicide mission. The ice comes away in chunks that ring like bells when they hit the ground. Each piece is crystal clear, so pure and cold that it seems to suck the warmth right out of the air around it. You can actually see the layers of freezing, like tree rings made of cold, each one representing a different storm, a different night when the temperature dropped just a little bit further toward the kind of cold that makes molecules stop moving. When you finally get the door open, the smell that emerges is a complex bouquet of preserved fish, dried meat, fermented seal oil, and what might charitably be called aged dairy products. It's not pleasant, but it's food, which in Greenland makes it practically gourmet dining. The storage shed is dark, cold, and filled with the kind of provisions that keep people alive when the outside world is actively trying to kill them. Inside you can see barrels of salted fish, strings of dried meat hanging from the rafters, and various containers filled with what you hope are edible substances, and not just creative interpretations of what food might look like after spending several months in temperatures that could preserve a mammoth. Everything is frozen solid, of course, because room temperature here is still well below freezing. You grab a piece of what might be dried seal meat. It's hard to tell when everything has been freeze-dried to the consistency of leather, and attempt to take a bite. It's like trying to chew on a boot that's been left outside during a particularly vindictive winter. Your teeth make no impression whatsoever. This isn't food so much as it's a theoretical concept of nutrition that happens to be shaped like something edible. But this is breakfast in Greenland. Not because it's appetizing, not because it's convenient, but because it's what keeps you from becoming another frozen corpse that the spring thaw will eventually reveal, assuming spring ever comes to this godforsaken frozen wasteland someone had the audacity to call green. Back inside the longhouse, you face your first major challenge of the day, getting dressed in a way that doesn't result in immediate death. This isn't about fashion or comfort. This is about creating enough layers between your skin and the outside world that your body heat doesn't immediately evacuate through every pore like it's fleeing a burning building. You start with the base layer, which is linen if you're lucky, or scratchy wool if you're not. The fabric feels like it was woven by someone with a personal grudge against human comfort, but it's what you've got. It's been worn by you, possibly by the previous owner, and definitely by whatever sheep it came from before that. The smell tells a story that involves hard work, limited bathing opportunities there, and a lifestyle where changing clothes is a seasonal event rather than a daily routine. Over the linen goes a wool tunic, thick enough to stop at arrows and scratchy enough to remind you that medieval comfort was apparently an oxymoron. The wool has been dyed a colour that was probably intended to be blue, but has faded to something that could generously be described as suspicious grey. It hangs on your frame like a tent, designed by someone who had only heard descriptions of human bodies and might have been thinking of cattle instead. Next comes the leg coverings, wool leggings that wrap around your calves and tie at the knee with leather strips that have frozen overnight into something resembling small whips. Getting them tied is like trying to perform surgery while wearing mittens. If surgery involved wrapping your legs in angry sheep fleece and hoping it stayed put while you walked through snowdrifts, the boots are a masterpiece of Viking engineering and desperation. They're made from seal skin, waterproofed with whale oil, and stuffed with hay that's supposed to provide insulation, but mostly just gives you the experience of walking around with small farms attached to your feet. They come up to your knees and tie with more leather straps, creating a complex rigging system that looks like it was designed by someone who really enjoyed knots and had no particular deadline for getting dressed. Over everything goes the cloak, a massive rectangle of wool that's been treated with lanolin to make it somewhat waterproof, though water-resistant might be more accurate. It's held in place by a bronze brooch that weighs approximately as much as a small weapon, and has definitely been used as one on more than one occasion. The cloak is supposed to reach your ankles, but the wind has strong opinions about where your cloak should go, and those opinions rarely align with your own. Then there are the accessories, which in Greenland are less about style, and more about not losing important body parts to frostbite. You wrap your head in a wool cap that covers everything except your eyes and mouth, giving you the appearance of a very large, very cold mummy. Over your hands go mittens made from sealskin with the fur still on the inside. They're warm, waterproof, and make fine motor control impossible, which is fine because there's no such thing as delicate work when everything you touch is frozen solid. Around your waist goes a leather belt that holds your knife, your fire-starting kit, and a small pouch containing whatever passes for emergency supplies. The knife is essential, not just as a tool, but as insurance against the moment when you need to cut yourself free from clothing that's frozen to your body or gear, that's decided to become permanently attached to your person. The entire process takes about 20 minutes and leaves you looking like a walking pile of laundry that's gained sentience and decided to brave the outdoors. You can barely move your arms, your peripheral vision is completely blocked, and walking requires a careful waddle that makes you look like a penguin with ambition problems. But here's the thing about Viking winter clothing. It works. Not comfortably, not elegantly, not in any way that would make modern outdoor enthusiasts jealous. But it keeps you alive, which in Greenland is literally the only fashion statement that matters. You catch a glimpse of yourself in a piece of polished metal that someone's using as a mirror. You look like you've been assembled by committee from spare parts of various dead animals. But you're warm. Or at least you're not actively dying from cold exposure, which counts as warm by local standards. The other Vikings are going through similar clothing rituals, each one transforming from a relatively normal-looking human into something that could charitably be described as mobile fur pile with eye holes. Nobody looks dignified, nobody looks comfortable, but everybody looks prepared to face a day in a climate that considers human survival to be more of a suggestion than a guarantee. The longhouse heating system is a masterpiece of Viking engineering that operates on the principle that fire good, cold bad, and everything else is just details you figure out as you go. The central fire pit is essentially a controlled attempt to set the building on fire in just the right way that it produces heat, without actually burning down your shelter, which is trickier than it sounds when your building materials are wood, turf, and hope. The fire itself is a delicate ecosystem that requires constant attention, like keeping a very warm, very temperamental pet that could kill everyone if you neglect it for too long. The fuel is whatever burns, driftwood when you can find it, dried seal blubber when you can't, and occasionally furniture when things get really desperate. Each fuel source has its own personality. Wood burns clean but fast, blubber burns hot but smoky, and furniture burns with the satisfying knowledge that you're literally consuming your own comfort for warmth. Keeping the fire going is a full-time job that gets rotated among the longhouse residents. You spend your shift feeding it small pieces of fuel, adjusting the airflow, and trying to find the perfect balance between enough heat to prevent death, and not so much smoke that breathing becomes optional. The smoke is supposed to exit through a hole in the roof, but smoke has its own opinions about where it wants to go, and those opinions usually involve visiting every person in the building before reluctantly heading skyward. The heat distribution is governed by the ancient principle of closest to the fire wins. If you're sitting right next to the fire pit, you alternate between being pleasantly warm and being slowly roasted like a very large piece of meat. Move 3 feet away, and you're back to seeing your breath and wondering if your extremities are still technically attached. The temperature gradient in the longhouse is so steep that you can literally have your front side overheating while your backside is developing hypothermia. Everyone has developed their own strategies for managing this thermal chaos. Some people rotate stoolily, like human rotisseries, ensuring even distribution of whatever heat they can capture. Others claim prime real estate near the fire and defend it with the determination of people who understand that cold equals death and death equals not being able to complain about the cold anymore. These sleeping arrangements are designed around shared body heat, which sounds romantic until you realise it means spending the night pressed against people who haven't had access to regular bathing facilities since sometime before the first snowfall. You sleep in a pile, like a litter of very large, very smelly puppies, because individual sleeping arrangements are a luxury that belongs to climates where water exists in liquid form. The walls provide some insulation. They are built from stacked stones and turf, which creates a barrier between you and the outside world, while still allowing the cold to seep in through every crack, gap, and architectural oversight. The builders clearly understood the concept of insulation in theory, but the execution involved materials that were available rather than materials that were ideal, which means your walls are about as weatherproof as a very thick sweater. Windows are a theoretical concept here. Light comes from the fire, the occasional oil lamp, and whatever manages to filter in through gaps in the construction. During the day, the longhouse has the lighting quality of a cave that's been slightly improved by the addition of controlled fire. At night, it has the lighting quality of a cave, period. The floor is covered with rushes, furs, and whatever else can create a barrier between human bodies and the frozen earth below. It's not comfortable, but comfort is a concept that belongs to places where the ground doesn't freeze solid for 8 months of the year. You're not trying to create luxury accommodations, you're trying to create the minimum conditions necessary to wake up alive tomorrow morning. Despite all of this, the longhouse works. Not elegantly, not efficiently, not in any way that would impress modern heating engineers, but it keeps a group of humans alive in conditions that would turn most modern people into decorative ice sculptures within hours. It's heated shelter reduced to its most basic, most essential elements: fire, walls, roof, and the shared understanding that everyone's survival depends on everyone else not screwing up the heating system. Staying alive in Greenland winter isn't an achievement you unlock once and then forget about. It's a daily quest that resets every morning and requires constant attention to approximately 50 different ways the environment is trying to kill you. Each day begins with a rapid assessment of what's still attached, what's gone numb, and what's making concerning sounds when you move it. So, first check is your extremities. Fingers, toes, nose, ears, the parts of your body that stick out and therefore serve as early warning systems for frostbite. You wiggle each finger individually, not because you're warming up for piano practice, but because fingers that don't wiggle are fingers that might need to be amputated before they turn black and fall off on their own. It's like a daily inventory of your body parts, making sure everything that was there yesterday is still present and functional today. Frostbite starts as a tingling sensation, which sounds harmless until you realise that tingling is your body's polite way of saying, this part of you is dying. The progression goes from tingling to numbness to a burning sensation that feels like someone is holding matches to your skin, which is ironic because what you actually need is warmth, not more burning sensations. The treatment for mild frostbite involves gradual rewarming, which means slowly bringing the affected area back to normal temperature while trying not to damage tissue that's become as fragile as frozen flowers. You don't rub frostbitten skin, that's how you turn minor tissue damage into major tissue loss. Instead, you warm it gently, usually against another person's body, which creates intimate bonding opportunities that nobody particularly wanted, but everyone occasionally needs. Severe frostbite is a different story entirely. When body parts turn white, then blue, then black, you're looking at amputation as the best case scenario. Vikings didn't have modern surgical techniques, anesthesia or antibiotics, which meant that losing a finger or toe to frostbite was often just the beginning of a much larger medical adventure that frequently ended in death by infection. Hypothermia is frostbite's evil cousin. Instead of attacking your extremities, it goes straight for your core temperature and your brain. The early stages make you shiver uncontrollably, which is your body's attempt to generate heat through muscle contractions. It's exhausting, but it works, at least temporarily. The problem is that shivering burns calories, and calories are a limited resource when you're living on dried fish and fermented seal oil. As hypothermia progresses, the shivering stops, which seems like good news until you realise it means your body has given up on trying to warm itself and is now focusing on keeping your vital organs functional for as long as possible. This is when people start making poor decisions, taking off clothes because they feel hot, wandering away from shelter because they're confused, or just lying down in the snow because it seems like a reasonable place for a nap. The Vikings dealt with hypothermia through aggressive rewarming, which meant stripping the victim naked and surrounding them with other naked, warm bodies until their core temperature came back up. It was effective, but it required community participation and a willingness to get very personally involved in someone else's medical emergency. Privacy was a luxury that belonged to warmer climates. Dehydration is another invisible killer. When it's cold, you don't feel thirsty the way you do in hot weather, but your body is still losing water through breathing, and that water needs to be replaced. The problem is that all the available water is frozen solid, and melting ice takes fuel that you might need for staying warm or cooking food. Every cup of water represents a choice between hydration and heat, and making the wrong choice too many times could kill you in entirely different ways. Food poisoning becomes a special adventure when you're already fighting hypothermia and dehydration. When your preserved fish goes bad, and it will, because preservation techniques are more hopeful than scientific, your body's response is to empty your stomach and intestines as quickly as possible. This leads to further dehydration and calorie loss at exactly the moment when you can least afford either one. But perhaps the most dangerous threat is psychological. When you're cold, hungry, uncomfortable, and surrounded by an environment that seems designed to kill you, depression stops being a mental health issue and becomes a survival threat. People who give up, who stop trying to stay warm or find food or maintain their shelter, die faster than people who get eaten by polar bears. The Vikings combated this with community, routine, storytelling, and the shared understanding that everyone's survival depended on everyone else's mental health. They didn't have therapists, but they had each other, and in a place like Greenland, that had to be enough. Finding food in Greenland winter isn't like shopping at a medieval farmer's market, it's more like participating in a very cold, very dangerous scavenger hunt, where the prizes might kill you and the environment is actively rooting against your success. Your food sources are limited to whatever you manage to kill, catch, or convince to die before the big freeze, plus whatever you were clever enough to preserve before everything turned into an outdoor freezer the size of a small country. The staple protein is seal, which sounds exotic until you realise that seal encompasses everything from catching them to butchering them to eating parts of them that modern people would use as craft supplies. Seals are perfect Greenland food because they're fat. They're available year-round if you can get to them through the ice, and they come with their own built-in packaging in the form of waterproof skin that doubles as storage containers, clothing material, and emergency shelter components. Catching seals in winter requires a technique that can charitably be described as optimistic ice fishing with sharp objects. You find a breathing hole in the ice, and seals need to breathe, which is both their weakness and your opportunity, and then you wait. You wait with a harpoon in temperatures that make your breath freeze for an animal that might surface in this exact spot or might decide to surface anywhere else in the approximately infinite expanse of frozen ocean around you. The waiting is the hardest part. You can't move much because movement scares seals, and scared seals are seals that breathe somewhere else. You can't talk because sound travels through ice like it's delivering personal messages to every seal in the area. You just stand there, holding a sharp stick, slowly turning into a human-shaped ice sculpture, hoping that a seal will be stupid enough or desperate enough to surface within stabbing distance. When you finally get a seal, the real work begins. Butchering a seal in sub-zero temperatures is like performing surgery while wearing mittens in a freezer that hates you personally. The meat needs to be cut and stored before it freezes solid. The blubber needs to be rendered for oil and fuel. The skin needs to be prepared for tanning. And the bones need to be saved for tools because nothing gets wasted when waste means death. Seal meat tastes like fish that went to sea and developed strong opinions about its lifestyle choices. It's rich, oily, and has a flavour that could charitably be described as oceanic, and less charitably described as what happens when fish decide to become mammals, but forget to update their taste profiles. You eat it because it's protein, it's fat, and it's what keeps you from becoming a very decorative corpse when spring finally arrives. Fish are another staple, but catching fish when the water is frozen solid requires advanced planning, basic engineering skills, and a willingness to spend hours sawing holes through ice that's thicker than you are tall. Ice fishing in Greenland isn't a relaxing weekend activity. It's a full-contact sport played against an environment that considers your success to be a personal insult. You start by finding a spot where you think fish might be hanging out under the ice, which is basically educated guessing based on water depth, current patterns, and whatever passes for local knowledge in a place where local means people who haven't frozen to death yet. Then you begin the process of cutting through ice that has the consistency and cooperativeness of frozen concrete. The ice cutting tools are essentially medieval power tools operated by human muscle power and Viking stubbornness. You use iron chisels, bone picks, and anything else that can chip away at ice without breaking immediately. The work is exhausting, each blow sends shock waves up your arms, and progress is measured in inches per hour rather than any meaningful rate of advancement. When you finally break through to water, you're rewarded with a hole that immediately starts trying to freeze over again, because ice doesn't take time off just because you worked hard to get rid of it. You have to keep the hole clear while fishing, which means constantly breaking the new ice that forms, while also trying to catch fish that are probably wondering why their ceiling suddenly developed a drafty hole that keeps letting in cold air. The fish you catch are immediately frozen solid by the air temperature, which is convenient for preservation but makes cleaning them an exercise in frustration. Scaling a fish that's frozen harder than rock requires tools designed for demolition work, and the results look less like food preparation and more like an archaeological excavation of something that used to be edible. But here's the thing about Greenland fishing. When you succeed big. Fish caught in winter waters are fat, healthy, and perfectly preserved by the natural freezer that is your entire environment. They might not be convenient to prepare, but they're better protein, they're nutrients, and they're the difference between making it through winter and becoming a cautionary tale about the importance of food storage. Preservation in Greenland isn't about making food taste better. It's about making food last long enough that you don't starve to death before the environment thaws enough to support agriculture, assuming you're optimistic enough to believe that Greenland will ever support agriculture. Every preservation technique is a gamble against time, bacteria, and your own future desperation levels. Smoking is the most reliable preservation method, partly because it actually works and partly because it gives you an excuse to keep fires burning, which serves the dual purpose of preserving food and preventing everyone from freezing to death. The smoking process involves hanging strips of meat and fish over low fires for days or weeks, slowly dehydrating them while infusing them with wood smoke that acts as a natural preservative and flavour enhancer. The smoking setup is basically a controlled attempt to turn your food storage area into a very large, very slow barbecue pit. You build racks from whatever wood you can find, hang the meat in strips thin enough to dry thoroughly, but thick enough that they don't just disappear into smoke themselves, and then maintain a steady low fire that produces more smoke than heat. It's like cooking, except the goal isn't to make dinner, but to create leather-like food products that will still be edible months later. The results taste like concentrated smoke with hints of whatever animal provided the original meat. It's not subtle. Smoked seal tastes aggressively like smoked seal, in the same way that a leather boot tastes like leather boot, but with more protein and fewer laces. You don't eat smoked meat because you enjoy the flavour profile. You eat it because it's still technically food after being stored in conditions that would turn fresh meat into biological warfare. Salt curing is another preservation method, assuming you can get salt, which in Greenland means trading with people who live in places where salt occurs naturally, or extracting it from seawater through a process that's more hope-based than scientific salt draws moisture out of meat, creating an environment where bacteria can't survive but humans can still technically chew and swallow the results. The salting process involves coating meat with as much salt as you can obtain, then packing it in containers where it can cure without being contaminated by the various other things trying to eat your food supply. This includes insects, rodents, and occasionally other humans who are having their own food storage challenges and might view your preserved meat as a solution to their problems. Salted meat has the texture of shoe leather that's been soaked in ocean water, then dried to the consistency of kindling. It requires extensive soaking before it's chewable, and even then it's more of an endurance challenge than a dining experience. But it's protein, it's preserved, and it's what stands between you and the kind of hunger that makes people start eyeing their neighbours with culinary speculation. Fermentation is preservation for people who enjoy living dangerously and don't mind their food fighting back during the digestion process. Fermented fish, fermented seal oil, and fermented dairy products from whatever animals you've managed to keep alive create foods that are technically preserved, but also technically horrifying to anyone with functioning taste buds. The fermentation happens in buried containers, where controlled bacterial action breaks down the food into something that's shelf-stable and nutritious, but smells like it died several times and came back as a vengeful spirit. Fermented seal oil, for example, provides essential vitamins and fats, but consuming it requires mental preparation and a willingness to temporarily abandon your sense of smell. Freeze-drying is nature's contribution to food preservation in Greenland. You don't need special equipment, you just leave food outside and let the combination of cold temperatures and dry air slowly remove all the moisture. leaving behind concentrated nutrition in a form that's lightweight, long-lasting, and bears only a theoretical resemblance to its original appearance. Freeze-dried fish looks like fish-shaped cardboard and has roughly the same texture and flavour, but it's portable, it doesn't spoil, and it can be reconstituted with hot water when you want to remember what fish used to taste like before you turned it into emergency rations. It's survival food in its purest form, not enjoyable, not convenient, but capable of keeping you alive when the alternative is death by starvation. The key to all preservation methods is timing, temperature control, and accepting that preserved food is going to taste like preserved food, rather than like fresh food that happens to be old. You're not trying to create gourmet meals, you're trying to create edible insurance policies that will still be technically food when you need them most, even if they taste like regret and smell like wet dog. Food rationing in Greenland operates on the principle that everyone needs to eat just enough to not die, but not so much that the food runs out before spring, assuming spring is actually coming and isn't just a theoretical concept that people invented to make winter seem temporary. It's a delicate mathematical balance between current hunger and future starvation, with the added complexity that nobody actually knows how long winter is going to last, or how much food it takes to keep a human being functional in conditions that would challenge a polar bear. The daily calorie allocation is determined by a combination of the available food stores, estimated winter length, and the harsh reality that some people are more essential to group survival than others. The hunters get larger portions because they're the ones bringing in new food, assuming they can find animals that haven't frozen solid or migrated to places with more reasonable climates. The food preparers get decent portions because someone needs to be functional enough to turn raw materials into something resembling meals. Everyone else gets whatever's left, which is usually not quite enough, but hopefully not so little that they become too weak to contribute to group survival. Children get priority in the food distribution, partly because they are the future of the settlement, and partly because hungry children are loud, persistent, and capable of making everyone else miserable through the sheer power of constant complaining. But even children don't get unlimited food. They get enough to keep growing, assuming there is enough, and assuming that growing is still a reasonable goal when the entire environment seems designed to prevent human development. The elderly face the harshest rationing decisions. They've survived long enough to accumulate wisdom and experience, which makes them valuable advisors, but they're also no longer capable of hunting, fishing, or doing the heavy physical work that keeps everyone alive. The food allocation for elderly community members becomes a complex calculation involving their knowledge value versus their caloric needs versus the brutal reality that food is finite and winter is not. Pregnant women create special rationing challenges because they're eating for two in a situation where there might not be enough food for one. They need extra calories and nutrition to support fetal development, but those extra calories have to come from somewhere, which usually means everyone else gets a little less. It's a mathematical problem with human consequences. Support the pregnancy and risk everyone's health, or maintain current rations and risk the pregnancy and the future of the community. The psychological aspects of rationing are almost as challenging as the physical ones. When you're constantly hungry, food becomes the primary focus of your thoughts, your dreams, and your waking fantasies. You spend hours thinking about meals you've eaten in the past, meals you might eat in the future, and meals that exist only in your imagination but seem more real and more desirable than anything that's actually available. Portion control requires constant vigilance against the human tendency to eat whatever's available right now rather than saving some for later. It's a daily test of willpower and community discipline. Everyone knows where the food is stored, everyone knows how much is left, and everyone is hungry enough that the temptation to take just a little extra is constant and almost overwhelming. The sharing protocols become critical social infrastructure. Who eats first, who gets the choice pieces, how portions are divided, and what happens when someone violates the rationing system. These aren't just practical concerns, they're the foundation of community survival. A fair distribution system keeps people cooperative and focused on group survival, rather than individual competition for limited resources. Theft of food becomes a crime that threatens everyone's survival. When someone takes more than their allocated portion, they're not just stealing food, they're stealing days or weeks of life from everyone else in the community. The penalties for food theft are correspondingly severe, because maintaining the rationing system is literally a matter of life and death for the entire group. The constant hunger affects everything else. Physical work becomes harder when you're operating on reduced calories. Mental clarity suffers when your brain is spending most of its energy thinking about food instead of solving problems. Social relationships strain under the pressure of everyone wanting more food than is available, and having to watch other people eat while you're still hungry. But the rationing system, harsh as it is, serves its purpose. It stretches limited food supplies across the entire winter, ensures that the most essential community members stay functional, and creates a framework for shared sacrifice that reinforces group solidarity. It's not fair in any meaningful sense. Fairness is a luxury that belongs to places where food is abundant. But it's equitable in the only way that matters. Everyone suffers, but everyone survives, assuming the calculations are correct and spring eventually arrives with new food sources. The ultimate success of the rationing system is measured not in satisfaction or comfort, but in the simple fact that when spring finally comes, there are still people alive to see it. Hungry people, thin people, people who've spent months dreaming about real meals, but living people who made it through a winter that was designed to kill them. That's the only victory that rationing can provide, and in Greenland, it's the only victory that matters. When everyone is equally miserable, traditional social hierarchies tend to flatten into something more practical and considerably more democratic than anyone intended. In Greenland, your social status isn't determined by your family name, your wealth, or your political connections. It's determined by your ability to contribute to group survival in conditions that don't care about your background, your education, or your personal feelings about manual labour. The leadership structure becomes remarkably fluid because the skills needed for survival don't always align with the skills that made someone important in warmer, safer places. A nobleman who's excellent at court politics might be completely useless at seal hunting, while a former thrall who grew up fishing might become the most valuable person in the settlement. When the choice is between following someone with impressive titles and following someone who actually knows how to find food, the titles suddenly seem less important. Decision-making processes speed up considerably when the consequences of poor decisions include everyone dying before spring. There's no time for extended debates, complex political manoeuvring, or the kind of careful consensus building that works well when you have the luxury of time and comfort. Decisions get made by whoever has the most relevant knowledge, and they get made quickly, because delays mean death, and death means you don't get to complain about the decision-making process. The work assignments are based purely on capability and necessity rather than social expectations or traditional gender roles. If the strongest person in the settlement is a woman, she gets assigned to the heaviest physical labour, regardless of what society might normally expect. If the most skilled hunter is young, old, or otherwise socially unconventional, they still get the hunting responsibilities because meat is more important than maintaining social conventions. Conflict resolution also becomes remarkably efficient when everyone understands that internal disputes are a luxury the group can't afford. Personal disagreements don't disappear, but they get managed through systems that prioritize group survival over individual satisfaction. Someone who refuses to work, steals food, or creates unnecessary drama becomes a threat to everyone's survival, and the community response is swift and decisive. The sharing of resources creates intimate bonds between people who might never have interacted in normal circumstances. When you're sharing body heat with someone to prevent hypothermia, social barriers break down quickly. Personal space becomes a theoretical concept when survival requires physical cooperation. Privacy becomes impossible when everyone lives in the same heated space, shares the same food, and depends on the same resources. Marriage and family relationships adapt to the survival priorities. Romantic partnerships might be based more on practical compatibility, complementary survival skills, shared work capacity, mutual support capabilities, than on traditional courtship patterns. Having children becomes a community decision as much as a personal one, because everyone's resources support child rearing, and children represent both future security and current resource drain. The elderly and disabled don't get abandoned or marginalised as they might in harsher survival situations, because their knowledge and experience become community assets even when their physical capabilities are limited. Someone who can't hunt might still know where to find emergency food sources, how to predict weather changes, or how to solve technical problems that could save everyone's life. Wisdom becomes as valuable as physical strength when survival depends on making good decisions under pressure. Communication patterns change to prioritise information that affects group survival. Gossip about personal relationships takes a back seat to discussions about food supplies, weather patterns, and practical problems that need solving. Conversations become more direct and less polite because there's no time for social niceties when important information needs to be shared quickly and clearly. The community develops its own internal culture that's adapted specifically to their shared survival situation. Jokes, stories, rituals, and social practices evolve to help manage the psychological stress of constant danger and discomfort. Humour becomes darker but more essential, because laughing at the absurdity of your situation is often the only alternative to crying about it. And crying doesn't improve anything but does waste energy and water. Leadership roles become temporary and task-specific rather than permanent and hierarchical. Someone might lead a hunting expedition based on their hunting expertise, while someone else leads food preparation based on their preservation knowledge, while a third person leads shelter maintenance based on their construction skills. Authority flows to whoever has the most relevant knowledge for the current challenge, creating a dynamic system that adapts to changing needs and circumstances. Living in close quarters with the same people for months at a time, when everyone is cold, hungry, and operating on reduced sleep, requires social skills that weren't covered in any medieval etiquette manual. The longhouse becomes a pressure cooker of personalities, personal habits, and individual coping mechanisms that either blend into functional community life or explode into conflicts that could get everyone killed. Personal hygiene becomes a community concern when everyone shares the same airspace and there is no possibility of getting away from someone who's developed a particularly offensive relationship with soap and water. Bathing in winter Greenland is a complex logistical challenge that requires heating large amounts of water, finding private space that's still warm enough to prevent hypothermia, and accepting that clean is a relative concept when your clothes can't be washed regularly and your environment is constantly trying to coat everything with smoke, grease, and the general residue of survival living. The smell situation becomes a test of everyone's tolerance and adaptability. People smell like wood smoke, preserved fish, unwashed wool, and whatever animals they've been butchering, preserving, or wearing. After a few weeks, everyone's personal odour signature becomes part of the ambient environment, like a very intimate form of air pollution that you either learn to ignore or let drive you to madness. Sleeping arrangements require diplomatic skills that would impress medieval ambassadors. Who sleeps next to whom, who snores, who moves around, who steals blankets, and who has nightmares that involve thrashing around and disturbing everyone else. These become matters of crucial community importance. Sleep is too valuable to waste on personal comfort preferences, but it's also too necessary to sacrifice completely for the sake of avoiding conflict. Personal space shrinks to whatever area you can claim with your body and immediate possessions. Privacy becomes impossible when everyone can hear every conversation, every bodily function, and every personal moment. The concept of alone time disappears entirely, replaced by the constant awareness that everything you do, say, or think is potentially observable by everyone else in your survival community. Food-related tensions become the most dangerous internal conflicts. Who ate more than their share, who's hiding extra full food, who's not contributing fairly to food preparation, and who's making unreasonable demands about meal quality. These disputes can escalate quickly when everyone is hungry and food security is uncertain. Accusations of food theft or unequal distribution can destroy communities' trust in ways that threaten everyone's survival. Work disputes require immediate resolution because essential tasks can't be postponed while people argue about fairness, methodology, or personal preferences. Someone who refuses to do their assigned work creates extra burden for everyone else. But forcing people to work when they're already stressed, tired, and hungry requires leadership skills that balance authority with psychological management. Motivation becomes challenging when the rewards for hard work are survival, and the punishment for laziness is everyone's death. Personal habits that might be minor annoyances in normal circumstances become major irritations when you can't escape from them. Someone who talks too much, someone who never talks, someone who has nervous habits, someone who's overly optimistic, someone who's constantly pessimistic. All of these personality traits get magnified and concentrated in ways that test everyone's patience and tolerance. Romantic relationships and sexual tensions add additional complexity to an already challenging social environment. Couples need privacy that doesn't exist, while single people deal with attractions and rejections in a context where everyone's emotional state affects group harmony. Jealousy, flirtation, and relationship conflicts become community problems when they interfere with work, assignments, resource sharing, or general group cooperation. Mental health issues become everyone's concern because depression, anxiety, or emotional breakdown in one person affects the entire group's survival prospects. Someone who's struggling mentally might not be able to perform their work duties, might make poor decisions that endanger others, or might create emotional stress that affects everyone else's psychological state. The community needs to provide support and intervention, but resources for mental health care are limited when everyone is dealing with their own stress and survival challenges. The development of house rules becomes essential for managing all these interpersonal challenges. Unwritten, but clearly understood agreements about noise levels, personal boundaries, work expectations, and conflict resolution create a framework for community life that prevents small disputes from becoming major conflicts. These rules evolve through trial and error, community discussion, and the harsh reality that rules that don't work get people killed. Ultimately, the social dynamics of winter survival in Greenland create bonds that are deeper and more intense than normal friendships or family relationships. When you've shared hunger, cold, fear, and the constant threat of death with someone, you develop a connection that's based on mutual dependence and shared experience, rather than common interests or social compatibility. The psychological pressure of confinement reaches breaking points that have nothing to do with rational thought and everything to do with the human mind's response to months of darkness, cold war, and social claustrophobia. Cabin fever in Greenland isn't just irritability. It's a genuine threat to community survival that can manifest as paranoia, violence, or complete emotional breakdown in people who are perfectly functional before winter locked them inside with the same faces, the same conversations, and the same problems day after day after day. The symptoms start subtly. Someone becomes hypersensitive to sounds that never bothered them before. The scraping of a spoon against a bowl, the particular way someone breathes, the repetitive thump of someone's nervous foot tapping. These minor irritations grow into major obsessions that consume mental energy and create internal rage that has nowhere to go except toward the people you're trapped with. Sleep patterns fragment when your mind can't process the constant stress of survival living. People develop insomnia, nightmares, or the opposite problem of sleeping too much as an escape from waking reality. The disrupted sleep affects everyone because sleep disturbances in shared living space mean noise, movement, and general disruption that prevents others from getting the rest they need to function effectively. Paranoid thinking emerges when people start seeing threats, conspiracies, and deliberate slights in normal interactions. Someone who's dealing with psychological pressure might become convinced that others are stealing their food, talking about them behind their back, or plotting against them in some way. These paranoid thoughts can become self-fulfilling prophecies when this accused person responds to false accusations with genuine anger and resentment. Explosive anger becomes dangerous when it erupts in confined spaces where people can't escape from each other and weapons are readily available for hunting and food preparation. A moment of rage that might be manageable in normal circumstances becomes life-threatening when the angry person has access to knives, axes, and other tools that can cause serious injury or death. The community needs systems for managing and diffusing anger before it escalates to violence. Depression manifests as withdrawal, hopelessness, and the kind of emotional shutdown that makes people stop caring about their own survival or the survival of others. A depressed person might stop eating, stop working, stop participating in community activities, or stop taking basic care of themselves. This creates additional burden for everyone else and can spread like a psychological infection when others see someone giving up hope. Compulsive behaviours develop as coping mechanisms for stress and boredom. Someone might become obsessed with organising and reorganising their possessions, counting and recounting supplies, or performing repetitive tasks that provide psychological comfort but don't contribute to actual survival needs. While these behaviours aren't directly harmful, they can consume time and energy that's needed for essential work. The Vikings developed several strategies for managing cabin fever and its dangerous psychological effects. Storytelling became a crucial community activity that provided mental stimulation, shared entertainment, and a way to process experiences and emotions through narrative. Stories about past adventures, legendary heroes, and mythological events gave people something to think about besides their current misery and provided a form of mental escape that didn't require physical resources. Physical exercise, despite the cold and limited space, became essential for maintaining both physical and mental health. People found ways to move, stretch, and engage in physical activities that burned excess energy, reduced stress, and provided some relief from the constant sitting and lying around that characterized winter survival. Even simple exercises like wrestling, lifting, or competitive activities helped manage the psychological pressure of confinement. Ritual and routine provided psychological structure that helped people cope with the uncertainty and monotony of survival living. Regular meal times, work schedules, cleaning routines, and social activities created predictable patterns that gave people something to anticipate and organize their days around. The routines might seem arbitrary, but they provided psychological stability in an environment where almost everything was unpredictable and dangerous. Creative activities using available materials gave people outlets for self-expression and mental stimulation that went beyond pure survival necessity. Carving, weaving, tool-making, and other crafts provided psychological benefits that justified the time and energy investment, even when the products weren't essential for survival. The act of creating something beautiful or useful provided a sense of accomplishment and purpose that helped maintain mental health. Music and singing became community activities that boosted morale, provided shared entertainment, and created positive emotional experiences that counteracted the constant stress of survival living. Songs could be work songs that made labour more enjoyable, storytelling songs that preserved cultural knowledge, or simple entertainment that helped people feel connected to each other and to their cultural identity. The management of cabin fever required community awareness and intervention when individuals showed signs of psychological breakdown. The group needed to recognise when someone was struggling and provide support, redirection, or intervention before psychological problems became survival threats. This might involve changing work assignments, providing extra attention and care, or simply ensuring that people who were struggling weren't left alone with their thoughts and fears. Viking technology in Greenland operated on the principle that everything you need to survive can be built from materials that animals don't want, rocks that aren't being used for anything else, and wood that's been personally retrieved from wherever wood goes to die. The tool-making process starts with identifying what you need to accomplish, and then figuring out how to accomplish it using only materials that can be found, killed, or carved from the landscape around you. Knives are the Swiss army tools of Viking survival. They cut food, prepare hides, carve wood, serve as eating utensils, and double as emergency weapons when the local wildlife gets too curious about your personal space. Making a knife requires iron, which you either brought with you, traded from someone else, or extracted from big iron using techniques that are part metallurgy and part wishful thinking. The iron gets heated, hammered, shaped and sharpened using tools that are themselves made from iron, creating a circular dependency that explains why metalworkers were valued community members. The knife handle is usually carved from whatever wood, bone or antler material is available, wrapped with leather strips for grip, and designed to be functional rather than decorative. Viking knives aren't beautiful, they're tools that need to work reliably when your life depends on cutting something quickly and effectively. The blade gets maintained through constant sharpening using whetstones, leather strops, and the kind of obsessive care that people give to objects that mean the difference between eating and starving. Fire-starting technology becomes critical when matches don't exist and your ability to create flame determines whether you freeze to death or merely suffer from mild hypothermia. The Viking fire kit includes flint, steel, tinder, and the manual dexterity to operate these components effectively, even when your hands are numb and shaking from cold. Striking sparks requires practice, patience, and the understanding that fire starting is a skill that can't be improvised under pressure. Tinder preparation is an art form that involves collecting and processing materials that will catch fire easily and burn long enough to ignite larger fuel sources. This includes dried grass, bark fibres, bird nests, cotton-like plant materials, and anything else that's dry, fibrous, and willing to burst into flame when exposed to sparks. Good tinder is prepared during warm weather and stored carefully for winter use, because trying to find dry tinder during a blizzard is a losing proposition. The fire building process follows a careful progression from spark to tinder to kindling to fuel wood, with each stage requiring different materials and techniques. You don't just pile wood together and hope for the best, you create a structure that allows airflow, provides graduated fuel sizes, and builds heat systematically from small flames to large fires. It's engineering applied to combustion, and getting it wrong means starting over in conditions where starting over might not be an option. Clothing repair becomes essential maintenance when your protective gear is also your life support system. Needles are carved from bone, thread is made from animal sinew, and patches are cut from whatever hide or fabric material is available. Sewing isn't a hobby or creative outlet, it's critical infrastructure maintenance that keeps your insulation system functional when failure means exposure death. The sewing process requires fine motor control that becomes challenging when your hands are cold, stiff, and operating inside mittens that make precise movements nearly impossible. Thread made from sinew is strong and durable but difficult to work with, especially when it's cold and brittle. Every stitch needs to be tight and secure because loose sewing fails under stress, and clothing failure in Greenland is a medical emergency. Tool maintenance extends to sharpening, cleaning, and repairing everything from knives to hunting spears to food preparation implements. Dull tools are dangerous tools because they require more force to operate effectively, increasing the risk of accidents, injuries, and equipment failure. A dull knife that slips during food preparation can cause cuts that lead to infection, disability, or death in an environment where medical care consists of hoping wounds heal before they kill you. Hunting equipment requires specialized tools designed for specific prey and hunting conditions. Harpoons for seal hunting need barbed points, strong shafts, and retrieval lines that can handle the weight and struggle of large marine mammals. Fishing hooks are carved from bone or carved metal, sized appropriately for target fish species, and attached to lines made from braided sinew or plant fibers. The bow and arrow technology adapted for Arctic conditions includes consideration for how cold weather affects wood flexibility, string elasticity, and arrow flight characteristics. Bowstrings made from sinew perform differently in extreme cold, requiring adjustments to tension and shooting technique. Arrows need to be fletched with materials that remain stable in cold weather, and tipped with points that can penetrate through thick animal hide and fat layers. Storage containers serve multiple functions beyond simple organization. They protect valuable materials from moisture, rodents, and temperature fluctuations while maintaining accessibility for daily use. Containers are made from treated animal skins, carved wood or woven plant materials, or combinations of materials that provide different protective characteristics. A good storage system prevents loss of essential supplies and organizes resources for efficient use under stress conditions. Viking construction in Greenland operates on the principle that buildings need to keep heat in, cold out, and people alive, while using only materials that can be obtained locally, and construction techniques that work when your construction crew is operating in conditions that make modern construction workers file workers' compensation claims. The building process starts with site selection, which means finding a location that provides some natural wind protection, while still offering access to water, building materials, and hunting areas. Foundation work involves digging into ground that's frozen solid for most of the year, using tools that are essentially sharp rocks attached to wooden handles. The excavation creates a semi-underground structure that takes advantage of Earth's natural insulation while providing protection from surface winds. The digging is exhausting work that requires multiple people taking turns with limited tools, and progress is measured in inches per day rather than any meaningful rate of advancement. Wall construction uses a combination of stone, turf, and wood that creates thick barriers designed more for insulation than structural elegance. The stones provide structural support and thermal mass, the turf provides insulation and helps seal gaps, and the wood provides framework and interior finishing. None of these materials are ideal by themselves, but together they create walls that are thick enough to provide meaningful protection from exterior temperatures. The stone selection process requires finding rocks that are the right size, shape, and density for construction use, while avoiding stones that will crack or crumble under pressure. Good building stones need to fit together reasonably well without extensive shaping, because the stone cutting tools are limited, and shaping stones by hand is time-consuming work that burns calories and energy that might be needed for other survival tasks. Turf cutting involves removing sections of grass, soil, and root systems that can be stacked like irregular bricks to create insulating walls. The turf needs to be cut in pieces large enough to provide structural stability but small enough that individuals can lift and position them without mechanical assistance. Good turf has dense root systems that hold the soil together and create durable building blocks that maintain their shape over time. Roof construction requires creating a structure that sheds water, supports snow loads, provides insulation, and includes ventilation for smoke removal without letting all the heat escape. The roof frame is built from whatever timber is available. covered with layers of turf, hides, or other materials that create weatherproof barriers. The roof also needs access openings for smoke removal, but these openings need to be designed to minimise heat loss while still providing adequate ventilation. Interior layout maximises the efficiency of available space while providing areas for sleeping, cooking, storage and social activities. The central fire pit becomes the focal point around which everything else is organised, with sleeping areas positioned to take advantage of radiant heat while maintaining safe distances from open flames. Storage areas need to be accessible but protected from moisture and temperature fluctuations. Ventilation systems balance the need to remove smoke and maintain air quality with the need to conserve heat and prevent drafts. Too little ventilation creates smoke problems and carbon monoxide risks, while too much ventilation makes heating impossible and creates cold drafts that make living spaces uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. The ventilation design uses natural airflow patterns and adjustable openings that can be modified based on weather conditions and heating needs. Insulation techniques involve using whatever materials provide air trapping and thermal barriers between interior and exterior spaces. Animal furs, dried grass, feathers, and other natural materials get packed into wall cavities hung as interior coverings or used as floor coverings that provide thermal barriers between human bodies and cold surfaces. The insulation materials need to stay dry to maintain their effectiveness, which requires careful design and maintenance. Heating efficiency becomes critical when fuel sources are limited, and heating failures can result in death by freezing. The fire pit design affects how efficiently fuel burns, how heat gets distributed, and how much smoke gets produced. A well-designed heating system maximizes heat output while minimizing fuel consumption and smoke production, creating livable interior conditions without exhausting available fuel supplies. Maintenance and repair. Systems need to be built into the construction design because buildings in extreme conditions require ongoing attention and periodic rebuilding. Wall sections that get damaged by the weather need to be easily replaceable. Roof sections that develop leaks need to be accessible for repair, and structural elements need to be designed for periodic reinforcement and replacement using locally available materials. Security considerations include protection from wildlife, weather, and potentially hostile humans, while maintaining accessibility for legitimate residents. Doors need to be strong enough to resist animal intrusion, while still allowing human passage. Windows need to provide light and ventilation while minimizing heat loss, and the overall structure needs to be defensible without compromising its primary function as weather protection. The building process becomes a community effort that requires coordination, shared labour, and collective problem-solving when challenges arise. Construction knowledge gets shared through hands-on participation rather than formal instruction, and building techniques get adapted and improved through trial and error over multiple construction seasons. The result is architecture that's functional rather than beautiful, but effective at keeping people alive in conditions that would quickly kill anyone living in less substantial shelter. Water management in Greenland operates on the principle that liquid water is a precious resource that requires constant effort to obtain, while frozen water is everywhere but requires fuel and time to convert into usable form. The daily water needs include drinking water for humans, cooking water for food preparation, cleaning water for basic hygiene, and industrial water for various survival tasks, all of which must be obtained through melting ice or snow using carefully managed fuel supplies. Ice harvesting becomes a regular community activity that requires identifying clean ice sources, cutting manageable blocks, and transporting them to storage areas where they can be processed as needed. Not all ice is suitable for human consumption. Ice that's formed from standing water, contaminated snow, or areas where animals have been active might contain bacteria, parasites, or other contaminants that can cause illness in people whose health is already compromised by cold, hunger, and stress. The ice cutting process uses tools that are essentially large knives and saws designed to score and break through ice that might be several feet thick. Cutting ice requires significant physical effort and carries risks of injury from sharp tools, falling through ice into water below, or exposure injuries from working in extreme cold for extended periods. The ice blocks need to be sized appropriately for transportation and storage while maximising the amount of usable water obtained from each cutting expedition. Snow melting provides an alternative water source that doesn't require cutting tools, but does require understanding the relationship between snow volume and water yield. Fresh snow has high air content and produces relatively small amounts of water when melted, while compressed or aged snow provides better water-to-volume ratios, but might be contaminated with wind-blown debris, animal waste or other materials that affect water quality. Water storage systems need to prevent freezing while maintaining accessibility for daily use. This might involve keeping water containers near heat sources, insulating storage systems, or accepting that stored water will freeze and planning for regular thawing as part of daily routines. Large water storage becomes impractical when the storage systems require heating to maintain liquid water, making daily water production a necessary routine rather than advanced preparation. Waste management in confined winter quarters becomes a critical health issue when human waste can't be disposed of through normal sanitation systems, and accumulated waste creates disease risks that can kill people more effectively than the cold weather. The waste disposal system needs to remove human waste from living areas while preventing contamination of water sources and food storage areas. Toilet facilities in winter to Greenland are essentially managed outdoor latrines that provide some privacy and weather protection while removing waste from immediate living areas. The latrine design needs to be accessible in extreme weather while preventing waste from contaminating water sources or creating health hazards for community members. The location needs to be convenient enough for regular use but distant enough to avoid odour and sanitation problems. The composting system allows organic waste to decompose in controlled ways that reduce volume and health risks, while potentially creating useful byproducts for future agricultural use. Assuming anyone is optimistic enough to believe in future agriculture in Greenland. Food scraps, human waste and other organic materials get managed through burial, composting or disposal systems that work within the constraints of frozen ground and limited processing options. Personal hygiene becomes a complex balance between cleanliness needs and resource availability when washing requires heated water, private space and time that might be needed for survival activities. Full body bathing becomes an occasional luxury rather than a daily routine, with most personal cleaning involving face and hand washing using small amounts of heated water and whatever soap substitutes are available. Laundry presents similar challenges to personal bathing. Cleaning clothes requires hot water, soap materials, drying space and time, all of which are limited resources during winter survival conditions. Most clothing maintenance involves brushing, airing and spot cleaning rather than complete washing, with the understanding that clean clothes are less important than warm clothes and that laundry mistakes can result in damaged clothing that compromises insulation systems. Food safety and kitchen sanitation become critical when food poisoning can kill people who are already dealing with nutritional stress and limited medical care. Cooking surfaces, food preparation tools and eating utensils need to be cleaned regularly despite the challenges of obtaining hot water and soap materials. Food storage areas need to be protected from contamination by waste, pests, and cross-contamination between different food types. Pest control addresses rodents, insects, and other creatures that compete for food supplies, contaminate stored materials, and potentially spread diseases in confined living spaces. Pest control methods need to work without using materials that are toxic to humans or that create fire hazards in buildings where open flames are the primary heating source. This typically involves physical barriers, traps, and storage methods that deny pests access to food and shelter. The community health management system addresses the reality that illness in one person quickly spreads to others in confined living spaces where isolation isn't possible, and medical care is limited to basic wound treatment and hoping that rest and nutrition are sufficient for recovery. Disease prevention becomes more important than disease treatment when treatment options are limited and prevention methods are available. The Greenland winter darkness isn't just an absence of light, it's an active presence that moves into your living space, sets up permanent residence in your brain, and slowly convinces you that the sun was just a pleasant hallucination you had once during a fever dream. The darkness here has weight, texture, and personality traits that include being vindictive, persistent, and completely uninterested in your mental health or your increasingly desperate need for vitamin D. The polar night begins gradually, with days getting shorter and shorter until one day the sun simply doesn't appear above the horizon, and everyone realizes that daylight has become a theoretical concept rather than a daily experience. The transition from short days to no days happens over weeks, giving you time to prepare mentally for total darkness, which is like giving someone time to prepare mentally for having their eyes permanently closed, helpful in theory, useless in practice. Your internal clock, which evolved to function with regular day-night cycles, completely loses its mind when faced with continuous darkness. Sleep schedules become suggestions rather than requirements. Mealtimes become arbitrary markers in an endless progression of identical dark hours. And the concept of morning becomes a nostalgic memory of times when morning actually meant something different from afternoon or evening. The psychological effects start subtly, with mild depression, irritability, and a general sense that the world has ended, but nobody bothered to send you an official notice. Your brain, which expects regular light exposure to maintain normal function, begins experiencing what could charitably be called operational difficulties, and less charitably called a complete psychological meltdown disguised as winter blues. Seasonal affective disorder in Greenland isn't a mild case of winter sadness. It's a full-contact mental health emergency that affects everyone to varying degrees and threatens community survival when too many people become too depressed to function effectively. The symptoms include extreme fatigue, hopelessness, social withdrawal, and the kind of deep sadness that makes every survival task feel like it requires more energy than you actually possess. The Vikings combated winter depression through community activities that provided artificial structure, social stimulation, and shared entertainment during the endless dark months. Storytelling became essential mental health care, providing narrative experiences that transported people's minds away from their current misery and into adventures, romances, and heroic tales that reminded them that other experiences besides cold, hunger, and darkness were theoretically possible. Feast celebrations, even with limited food supplies, created special occasions that marked time passage and provided something to anticipate during the otherwise undifferentiated progression of dark days. These celebrations might involve special meals prepared from saved ingredients, group activities, competitions, or rituals that reinforced community bonds and provided psychological relief from survival routines. Music and singing served multiple functions beyond entertainment. They provided group activities that required participation and cooperation, created positive emotional experiences that counteracted depression, and preserved cultural knowledge and identity during periods when maintaining connection to normal life became psychologically essential for survival. Physical exercise became crucial for maintaining both physical and mental health when natural activity levels decreased due to confinement and reduced daily tasks. People found ways to engage in physical activities that provided exercise, burned excess energy, and created positive physical sensations that helped combat the lethargy and physical deterioration associated with depression and inactivity. Creative activities using available materials gave people outlets for self-expression and mental stimulation that went beyond pure survival necessity. Carving, weaving, tool decoration, and other crafts provided psychological benefits that justified the time and resource investment, even when the products weren't essential for immediate survival. The act of creating something provided a sense of accomplishment and purpose that helped maintain mental health during periods of extreme stress. Sleep management became complex when normal sleep cues disappeared and people needed to maintain regular rest patterns without natural light signals. The community developed artificial schedules and routines that provided structure and helped people maintain circadian rhythms despite the absence of natural day-night cycles. This required discipline and community cooperation to maintain consistent timing for meals, activities, and rest periods. Light sources became precious resources that served psychological as well as practical functions. Oil lamps, candles, and firelight provided not just illumination, but psychological comfort and visual stimulation that helped combat the oppressive effects of total darkness. The flickering light created visual interest and warmth that provided sensory stimulation and emotional comfort during the long dark months. Social interaction patterns adapted to provide mental health support and prevent the kind of social isolation that could lead to complete psychological breakdown. People developed systems for checking on each other's mental state, providing support during difficult periods, and intervening when someone showed signs of dangerous depression or emotional instability that could threaten their own survival or the survival of others. Mental health maintenance in extreme survival conditions requires techniques that wouldn't be covered in any normal psychology textbook, because normal psychology assumes you're not spending months trapped in a frozen wasteland with the same people, eating the same terrible food and wondering if spring is actually going to return or if winter is just the new permanent state of reality. The psychological challenges go beyond simple stress management. into the realm of maintaining basic cognitive function and emotional stability when everything in your environment is designed to break your spirit. Routine becomes the foundation of mental health when external structure disappears and chaos threatens to overwhelm your ability to function normally. Creating and maintaining daily schedules provides psychological anchoring that helps people feel like they have some control over their lives even when most circumstances are completely beyond their influence. The routines might seem arbitrary, but they provide predictable patterns that help organize thoughts and activities around manageable frameworks. Goal setting needs to be adapted to survival circumstances where long-term planning is impossible, and immediate goals focus on basic survival needs rather than personal achievement or satisfaction. Short-term, achievable goals provide psychological victories and sense of progress that help maintain motivation and hope during periods when larger life purposes seem irrelevant or impossible to pursue. Memory exercises and mental games help maintain cognitive function when intellectual stimulation is limited, and mental challenges are reduced to basic survival problem solving. People develop word games, mathematical puzzles, memory challenges, and other mental activities that exercise different aspects of cognitive function and provide entertainment that doesn't require physical resources or special equipment. Emotional regulation techniques help people manage anger, fear, sadness, and other emotional responses that can become overwhelming in high-stress survival situations. These might include breathing exercises, meditation practices, physical movement, or cognitive strategies that help people process difficult emotions without allowing them to interfere with the essential survival activities or community relationships. Stress management becomes essential when chronic stress from survival conditions threatens to cause mental and physical breakdown that compromises individual and community survival. People develop personal strategies for managing stress responses, recognizing stress symptoms, and taking action to reduce stress levels before they become debilitating or dangerous. Reality testing helps people distinguish between real threats and anxiety-driven fears when survival situations create heightened alertness that can escalate into paranoia or unrealistic threat assessment. Community members help each other maintain perspective, evaluate situations objectively, and make rational decisions even when fear and stress are affecting judgment and perception. Hope maintenance becomes a survival skill when despair threatens to overwhelm people's willingness to continue survival efforts and maintain community cooperation. This involves focusing on positive possibilities, celebrating small victories, remembering past successes, and maintaining belief in eventual improvement even when current conditions seem hopeless. Social support systems provide emotional care and practical assistance when individual coping resources become inadequate for managing survival stress. People develop formal and informal ways to provide emotional support, share coping strategies, and intervene when community members need help managing psychological challenges that exceed their individual capacity. Conflict resolution becomes critical when personality clashes and disputes threaten community harmony and cooperation during periods when everyone's survival depends on working together effectively. People develop strategies for managing disagreements, mediating conflicts, and maintaining working relationships even when personal tensions and stress make cooperation difficult. Identity maintenance helps people remember who they are beyond their current role as survival-focused community members. This involves maintaining connections to personal values, interests, relationships, and life goals that exist outside the immediate survival context, and provide psychological continuity with normal life experiences. Meaning-making activities help people find purpose and significance in their survival experiences, rather than viewing their situation as simply enduring hardship until it ends. This might involve viewing their experience as testing personal strength, contributing to community, welfare, or participating in historical adventures that connect them to larger human experiences of survival and perseverance. Future planning provides psychological hope and direction, even when immediate circumstances make long-term planning seem irrelevant or impossible. People maintain connections to future possibilities, make plans for post-survival activities, and preserve dreams and goals that provide motivation to continue survival efforts and maintain investment in eventual return to normal life. Group psychology in extreme survival conditions operates on principles that are completely different from normal social psychology, because the stakes are literally life and death, and the usual social rules about politeness, personal space, and individual preferences become luxury items that the community can't afford when everyone's survival depends on effective cooperation and mutual support. The community becomes a psychological organism where individual mental health affects group survival, and group dynamics determine individual psychological outcomes. Leadership psychology requires people to make decisions that affect everyone's survival while managing their own stress, fear, and uncertainty about outcomes that could result in everyone's death if the decisions are wrong. Leaders need to project confidence and competence even when they're struggling with the same psychological pressures as everyone else, while also remaining open to input and collaboration from other community members who might have essential knowledge or perspectives. Follower psychology involves trusting leadership decisions and contributing to group efforts, even when individual preferences, fears, or disagreements make cooperation difficult or personally uncomfortable. Followers need to balance personal autonomy with group loyalty while managing the psychological stress of having limited control over circumstances that directly affect their survival and well-being. Group decision-making becomes complicated when stress, fear, and fatigue affect everyone's judgment, while decisions can't be postponed until everyone feels mentally clear and emotionally stable. The group needs systems for making effective decisions under pressure while ensuring that important perspectives are considered and that decisions are implemented effectively, even when some community members have reservations or disagreements. Conflict management requires techniques that resolve disputes and tensions without destroying the cooperation and trust that everyone needs for survival. Conflicts can't be avoided when people are stressed, confined, and dealing with life-threatening challenges, but they need to be managed in ways that preserve working relationships and community cohesion, rather than escalating into division that threaten group survival. Scapegoating becomes a psychological risk when group stress and frustration need outlets, and people look for someone to blame for problems, challenges, or failures that are actually caused by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The community needs to recognize and prevent scapegoating patterns that could result in isolation, persecution, or removal of community members who are essential for group survival. Morale management involves maintaining group optimism, motivation, and cooperative spirit during periods when circumstances provide plenty of reasons for despair, pessimism, and individual self-preservation at the expense of community welfare. Morale affects everyone's willingness to contribute effort, take risks, and make sacrifices for community benefit, rather than focusing exclusively on individual survival needs. Communication patterns need to facilitate essential information sharing while managing the psychological stress of constant interaction with the same people during high-stress conditions. People develop ways to communicate effectively about practical matters while also providing emotional support and maintaining social connections that preserve psychological health and community bonds. Privacy management becomes complex when physical privacy is impossible, but psychological privacy becomes essential for mental health and individual identity maintenance. People develop informal systems for respecting personal boundaries, providing individual space within group settings, and allowing people to have private thoughts and emotions without constant social scrutiny or pressure. Cultural maintenance helps preserve community identity and values during survival conditions that reduce life to basic physical needs and survival activities. Maintaining cultural practices, values, stories, and traditions provides psychological continuity and meaning that connects survival activities to larger life purposes and community identity beyond immediate survival needs. Celebration and ritual activities provide positive psychological experiences that counteract the stress and hardship of survival conditions while reinforcing community bonds and shared identity. These activities might seem like unnecessary resource use during survival conditions, but they provide psychological benefits that improve everyone's to cope with hardship and maintain cooperation and motivation over extended periods. Support system development ensures that community members who are struggling with psychological challenges receive help and intervention before individual problems become threats to group survival. People develop formal and informal ways to monitor each other's psychological state, provide assistance during difficult periods, and maintain community inclusion for people who are dealing with mental health challenges that affect their ability to contribute normally to group activities. Recovery and resilience building help people develop psychological strength and coping capacity that allow them to maintain function during extreme stress, while also preparing for eventual return to normal life after survival conditions end. This involves building psychological skills, maintaining hope and optimism, and developing confidence in personal and community ability to overcome challenges and survive difficult circumstances. Spring in Greenland doesn't arrive like a gentle awakening or a gradual warming trend. It sneaks up on you after months of winter that seem designed to last until the end of time, appearing first as tiny, almost invisible changes that make you wonder if you're hallucinating from malnutrition, or if the ice really is starting to show hairline cracks that might eventually become something resembling seasonal change. The first signs are so subtle that you could miss them entirely if you weren't desperately watching for any indication that winter might eventually release its death grip on your corner of the world. The light returns first, not warmth, but the gradual extension of daylight hours that have been reduced to brief glimpses of sun that barely cleared the horizon before disappearing again for another 20-hour night. The sun starts staying up a few minutes longer each day, creating a slow progression from complete darkness to twilight to actual daylight that feels like a miracle after months of living by firelight and whatever illumination you could create from oil lamps and burning seal blubber. Your body responds to the returning light in ways that surprise you after months of artificial light cycles and darkness-induced depression. Energy levels increase slightly, sleep patterns begin to normalize, and the crushing psychological weight of endless night starts to lift just enough that you remember what it feels like to have thoughts that aren't completely focused on immediate survival needs and staying warm until tomorrow. The ice begins showing stress patterns, not melting, not breaking up, but developing the kind of hairline cracks and surface changes that indicate that temperatures are fluctuating enough to affect ice structure even when the fluctuations are between deadly cold and slightly less deadly cold. These changes are invisible unless you're looking for them, but after months of studying your frozen environment for any signs of change, you've developed expertise in ice psychology. Bird sounds return to the landscape as migratory species begin moving through areas that have been silent except for wind and the occasional sound of ice cracking under pressure. The bird calls provide auditory evidence that the world outside your immediate survival situation is still functioning, and that other living creatures believe strongly enough in spring's eventual arrival that they're willing to bet their lives on seasonal migration patterns. Wildlife activity increases as animals that have been hibernating, hiding, or conserving energy through the worst of winter begin moving around more actively. This might mean more hunting opportunities, but it also means increased competition for food resources as animals emerge from winter in the same weakened, hungry condition as the human survivors who have been waiting for spring with varying degrees of hope and despair. The wind patterns change subtly, bringing air that doesn't have quite the same bitter edge that characterized the deep winter storms. The temperature is still well below freezing, but there's something different about the cold that's still dangerous, still capable of killing you if you make mistakes, but it doesn't have the same malicious personality that made winter weather seem personally vindictive toward human survival attempts. Snow conditions begin to change as temperature fluctuations affect snow crystal structure and create surface conditions that are subtly different from the concrete hard snow that characterized deep winter. The snow might be slightly softer, might compress differently, might respond to footsteps in ways that indicate internal changes, even when the surface temperature is still cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Water sources show the first signs of potential change as ice thickness stops increasing, and surface conditions begin to suggest that the relentless freezing process might be slowing down. This doesn't mean liquid water is available yet, but it suggests that the ice isn't getting thicker every day, and that eventually, theoretically, hopefully, possibly, some of it might begin to weaken enough to provide access to water that doesn't require fuel-intensive melting processes. Food storage assessments become critical as you evaluate what supplies remain and how long they need to last before new food sources become available. Spring planning involves calculating whether your preserved food will stretch through the transition period when winter hunting becomes unreliable, but spring opportunities haven't yet developed into dependable food sources. The community's psychological state begins to shift as people start to believe that survival through winter is actually possible rather than just a desperate hope that keeps everyone working toward an uncertain future. Morale improves gradually as evidence accumulates that spring might actually exist and that the months of survival effort might actually result in living long enough to see seasonal change and eventual return to more normal living conditions. Preparation activities begin to focus on spring opportunities rather than just winter survival maintenance. People start thinking about repair work that can be done when weather permits, hunting and fishing activities that will become possible as ice conditions change, and the transition from survival mode to recovery and rebuilding mode that will be necessary if spring actually arrives and provides opportunities for more normal life activities. The ice breakup in Greenland happens with all the subtlety of a geological disaster, transforming a stable frozen landscape into a chaotic water world where everything you've learned about winter travel, hunting and survival suddenly becomes irrelevant and possibly dangerous. The thaw doesn't happen gradually like snow melting off a roof. It happens in dramatic events that can change the entire geography of your area within hours and leave you stranded, flooded, or cut off from essential resources that were accessible yesterday, but are now separated from you by channels of rushing water and floating ice chunks the size of buildings. The sound of ice breaking becomes the background soundtrack of spring, a constant groaning, cracking and grinding noise that sounds like the earth itself is coming apart at the seams. The ice doesn't break quietly or politely. It splits with sounds like thunder, crashes into other ice with impacts that shake the ground, and creates acoustic chaos that makes communication difficult and sleep nearly impossible. Travel routes that have been reliable all winter suddenly become death traps as ice that looked solid yesterday develops pressure cracks, weak spots, and areas where walking might result in falling through into water that's cold enough to cause immediate hypothermia and strong enough to carry you away from any possibility of rescue. Every step requires evaluation of ice conditions that can change between morning and afternoon. Hunting strategies need complete revision, as ice conditions that made seal hunting possible during winter create new opportunities and new dangers as animals adjust their behaviour to changing ice conditions. Seals that were accessible through breathing holes might now be accessible through open water, but hunting from unstable ice platforms requires completely different techniques and much higher risk assessment. Flooding becomes a serious concern as melting ice and snow create water runoff that can overwhelm drainage systems, flood storage areas, and make previously habitable areas temporarily uninhabitable. Water damage to food supplies, tools, and shelter materials can undo months of careful preservation and preparation, creating crisis situations just when you thought you were transitioning from survival mode to recovery mode. The weather becomes even more unpredictable as winter and spring weather systems conflict with each other, creating rapid temperature changes, sudden storms, and weather patterns that can shift between blizzard conditions and thaw conditions within the same day. These rapid changes make planning difficult and create situations where clothing and equipment appropriate for morning conditions become inadequate or dangerous by afternoon. New food opportunities emerge as ice breakup creates access to marine resources that weren't available during winter. But taking advantage of these opportunities requires adapting hunting and fishing techniques to unstable conditions where traditional methods might not work effectively. The transition from winter hunting to spring hunting requires learning new skills while managing increased risks. Water. Access improves dramatically as ice melting provides liquid water sources that don't require fuel to melt, but the new water sources need to be evaluated for safety, accessibility, and reliability. Meltwater from ice and snow might be contaminated with materials that accumulated during winter, and rushing water from ice breakup might be too dangerous to access safely. Shelter maintenance becomes critical as changing weather conditions create new stresses on buildings and infrastructure that were designed primarily to handle cold and wind, rather than temperature fluctuations, water infiltration, and the ground movement that can accompany major ice breakup events. Repairs and reinforcements need to be completed quickly before spring weather creates more serious damage. Community coordination becomes more complex as improved weather conditions make travel and communication possible, but also create opportunities and responsibilities that require group decision-making about resource allocation, work priorities, and risk management. Spring planning involves balancing immediate opportunities against long-term preparation needs for the following winter. The psychological transition from winter survival to spring recovery creates its own challenges as people need to shift from conservative survival thinking to more optimistic planning and risk-taking that takes advantage of spring opportunities while maintaining the caution and preparation habits that enabled winter survival. The mental adjustment from scarcity thinking to opportunity thinking requires conscious effort and community support. Tool and equipment maintenance becomes urgent as changing conditions require different tools and equipment that might have been stored or neglected during winter when they weren't needed. Spring activities require preparation and maintenance of tools that will be essential for taking advantage of spring opportunities, but that might need repair or replacement after months of storage in extreme conditions. The knowledge gained from surviving a Greenland winter becomes part of you, in ways that go beyond intellectual understanding. It's information written into your bones, carved into your reflexes, and embedded in your instincts in ways that will affect every future decision about risk, preparation, and the relationship between human ambition and natural forces. The lessons aren't academic theories that you might forget or professional skills that you might choose not to use. They're survival wisdom that becomes part of your fundamental understanding of how the world works when civilization's safety nets disappear and life reduces to basic questions about staying alive until tomorrow. Preparation becomes a completely different concept when you've experienced the consequences of inadequate preparation in conditions where mistakes can kill you quickly and efficiently. Every future planning decision gets evaluated against the memory of winter nights where insufficient fuel meant choosing between staying warm and cooking food, when inadequate food supplies meant hunger that affected your ability to think clearly and work effectively, when insufficient tool maintenance meant equipment failure at moments when your life depended on having functional equipment. Resource management skills develop into permanent habits that affect how you approach abundance and scarcity in all future circumstances. When you've lived through periods where every calorie, every piece of fuel, and every tool had to be allocated carefully because waste meant death, you develop perspectives on consumption and conservation that influence lifelong attitudes toward material resources and personal consumption patterns. Community cooperation becomes a fundamental value, rather than a social preference when you've experienced situations where individual survival was impossible and group survival required everyone contributing their best efforts towards shared goals. The memory of depending completely on other people for survival creates permanent appreciation for interdependence and mutual support that affects future relationships and community involvement. Risk assessment abilities become highly developed when you've had to make daily decisions about activities that carried real possibility of death or serious injury. Living through conditions where poor judgment about weather, ice conditions, food safety, or equipment reliability could result in immediate life-threatening consequences develops decision-making skills that transfer to other high-stakes situations throughout life. Resilience and stress management become internalized capabilities rather than concepts you've heard about or techniques you've practiced. When you've maintained function and cooperation during months of extreme stress, discomfort, and uncertainty, you develop confidence in your ability to handle difficult circumstances and maintain effectiveness even when conditions are far from ideal. Appreciation for basic comforts transforms completely when you've lived without heat, adequate food, comfortable shelter, privacy, and other amenities that normally seem like basic requirements rather than luxuries. The memory of genuine deprivation creates permanent gratitude for simple comforts and reduces tolerance for complaints about minor inconveniences that seem trivial compared to actual hardship. Environmental awareness becomes sophisticated and permanent when you've had to read weather patterns, ice conditions, animal behavior, and other natural signs as matters of life and death, rather than casual interest. The skills developed for survival in extreme conditions create lifelong abilities to observe and interpret environmental conditions that most people never develop because their survival doesn't depend on environmental awareness. Self-reliance skills become permanent capabilities when you've had to solve problems using only available resources and personal knowledge, rather than relying on external expertise, specialized equipment, or professional services. The experience of creating solutions from basic materials using fundamental principles develops problem-solving confidence and practical skills that remain useful in many future situations. Mental toughness becomes internalized strength rather than theoretical concept when you've maintained hope, cooperation, and effectiveness during months of conditions that tested every aspect of psychological resilience. The knowledge that you can function effectively even under extreme stress creates permanent confidence in your ability to handle challenges that would have seemed overwhelming before experiencing genuine survival conditions. Perspective on modern complaints and difficulties becomes permanently altered when you've experienced actual life-threatening hardship and genuine scarcity. Problems that seemed serious before survival experience get re-evaluated based on comparison with actual survival challenges, creating more balanced and practical perspectives on the relative importance of different types of problems and stress. Leadership abilities develop naturally when group survival requires everyone to contribute their best skills and take responsibility for community welfare, rather than focusing exclusively on personal comfort and individual preferences. The experience of shared responsibility for group survival creates leadership skills and community-minded attitudes that transfer to many future group situations and collaborative efforts. The integration of survival experience into normal life becomes a lifelong process of applying lessons learned under extreme conditions to everyday situations that involve risk management, resource allocation, community cooperation, and personal resilience. The knowledge gained from winter survival in Greenland becomes a permanent part of personal identity and decision-making framework that influences how you approach challenges, opportunities, and relationships for the rest of your life. The Vikings who survived Greenland winters didn't just endure extreme conditions, they discovered fundamental truths about human nature, community cooperation, and the relationship between individual strength and collective survival that remain relevant centuries later in a world where most people never experience genuine life-threatening hardship or complete dependence on other humans for survival. Their experience demonstrates that humans are capable of extraordinary endurance, adaptation, and cooperation when circumstances require it, but also reveals the psychological and social costs of pushing human capabilities to their absolute limits. The survival stories that emerged from Greenland settlements became legendary, not because they were unique historical events, but because they demonstrated universal human qualities that transcend cultural boundaries and historical periods. Every culture has survival stories, but few involve the combination of environmental extremes, technological limitations, and social challenges that characterized Viking life in Greenland during the medieval period. Modern survival psychology draws heavily on lessons learned from historical survival situations like the Greenland settlements, where people had to develop psychological resilience, community cooperation, and resource management skills without access to modern technology, communication systems, or rescue services. The psychological strategies that enabled Viking survival remain relevant for modern emergency situations, military operations, and other circumstances where people must function effectively under extreme stress with limited resources. The community structures that emerged in Greenland settlements demonstrate principles of democratic decision-making, resource sharing, and conflict resolution that work under extreme stress when traditional authority structures become less relevant than practical expertise and community cooperation. These lessons about emergency governance and crisis leadership provide insights that remain applicable to modern organizations and communities facing crisis situations. The relationship between individual identity and community survival that characterize Greenland settlements illustrates the balance between personal autonomy and group loyalty that emerges in survival situations where individual preferences must be subordinated to community needs, but where individual contributions and expertise remain essential for group survival. This balance provides insights into leadership, teamwork, and organizational effectiveness that transfer to many modern contexts. The resource management strategies developed in Greenland demonstrate principles of conservation, allocation, and planning that remain relevant in modern contexts involving limited resources, uncertain timelines, and high-stakes outcomes. The techniques for managing scarce resources under pressure provide lessons that apply to business management, project planning, and personal financial management in situations involving significant risk and uncertainty. The psychological resilience demonstrated by Greenland survivors illustrates human capacity for maintaining hope, cooperation, and effectiveness during extended periods of extreme stress and hardship. These examples provide inspiration and practical guidance for people facing serious personal challenges, professional difficulties, or community crises that require sustained effort and psychological strength over extended periods. The technological innovation that emerged from Greenland survival demonstrates human creativity in developing solutions using available resources and basic principles, rather than relying on specialized equipment or expert knowledge. These examples of practical problem-solving provide models for approaching challenges in resource-limited situations where conventional solutions aren't available. The social cooperation that enabled Greenland survival provides examples of how people can work together effectively despite personality differences, conflicting interests, and high-stress conditions when shared survival depends on collaboration and mutual support. These lessons about team building and conflict resolution remain applicable in many modern group situations that involve cooperation under pressure. The long-term perspective required for Greenland survival demonstrates the importance of planning, patience, and delayed gratification in achieving goals that require sustained effort over extended periods. These lessons about persistence and strategic thinking provide guidance for personal and professional situations that involve long-term projects, career development, and other goals that require consistent effort despite short-term difficulties and setbacks. The integration of survival experience into normal life that characterized successful Greenland survivors provides examples of how people can apply lessons learned under extreme conditions to improve their effectiveness and resilience in normal circumstances. These examples demonstrate how survival skills, psychological resilience, and community cooperation abilities can enhance quality of life and personal effectiveness even when survival isn't threatened. The cultural preservation that occurred in Greenland settlements despite extreme survival conditions demonstrates the importance of maintaining identity, values, and traditions even when immediate circumstances require focus on basic survival needs. These lessons about cultural continuity provide guidance for communities and organizations facing crisis situations where maintaining core values and identity becomes challenging but remains important for long-term success. The techniques developed by Vikings in Greenland continue to influence modern survival training, emergency preparedness, and adventure sports in ways that demonstrate the timeless relevance of fundamental survival principles despite dramatic advances in technology, equipment, and scientific understanding. Modern survival experts study historical survival situations not just for academic interest, but for practical insights that remain applicable when technology fails, resources become scarce, or people find themselves in situations where basic survival skills become essential for staying alive. Military survival training incorporates lessons learned from historical survival situations like Greenland settlements, focusing on psychological resilience, resource management, and community cooperation under extreme stress, rather than relying exclusively on modern equipment and technology that might not be available in actual survival situations. The mental toughness and practical problem-solving abilities demonstrated by Viking survivors provide training models that remain relevant for modern military personnel. Wilderness survival education draws heavily on historical examples of long-term survival in extreme environments, emphasizing the importance of preparation, community cooperation, and psychological resilience that enabled people like the Greenland Vikings to survive extended periods in life-threatening conditions, using only basic technology and local resources. These historical examples provide inspiration and practical guidance that technology cannot replace. Emergency preparedness planning for natural disasters, economic disruption, and other crisis situations incorporates lessons learned from communities that survived extreme hardship using resource management, community cooperation, and psychological resilience, rather than relying on external assistance or technological solutions. The Greenland survival experience provides models for community resilience that remain relevant for modern emergency planning. Adventure sports and extreme recreation often involve deliberately placing yourself in situations that approximate historical survival conditions, requiring participants to develop skills, mental toughness, and risk management abilities that mirror those required by Viking survivors. Modern adventure athletes study historical survival stories for insights into mental preparation and practical techniques that enhance safety and performance in extreme conditions. Psychological research into stress management, resilience building, and community cooperation draws on historical survival examples to understand human capabilities under extreme conditions and develop training methods that enhance psychological strength and social cooperation skills. The psychological strategies that enabled Viking survival provide research models that inform modern approaches to mental health and stress management. Organizational leadership training incorporates lessons learned from historical survival situations, where leadership emerged naturally, based on expertise and community needs, rather than formal authority or traditional hierarchies. The leadership qualities demonstrated by successful Viking survival communities provide models for effective leadership under pressure that transfer to business, military, and non-profit organizations. Environmental education and climate change adaptation planning draw on historical examples of communities that adapted to extreme environmental conditions using available resources and community cooperation rather than technological solutions or external assistance. The Greenland Viking experience provides lessons about environmental adaptation that remain relevant as the modern communities face climate-related challenges. Minimalist living movements and voluntary simplicity advocates often reference historical survival communities as examples of how people can live satisfying lives with basic resources, strong community connections, and focus on essential needs rather than material accumulation and technological complexity. The Greenland survival experience provides inspiration for people choosing simpler lifestyles. Team building and group dynamics training incorporates lessons learned from communities that developed effective cooperation under extreme pressure, focusing on the social skills and group processes that enabled survival when individual success was impossible and group failure meant death for everyone. The community cooperation demonstrated in Greenland provides models for modern team effectiveness. Personal development and self-improvement programs draw on historical survival stories as examples of human potential for growth, resilience, and achievement under challenging conditions, demonstrating that people can develop capabilities and strengths they didn't know they possessed when circumstances require personal growth and adaptation. The Viking survival experience provides inspiration for personal challenge and development. Cultural preservation efforts in communities facing economic, environmental, or social pressures study historical examples of communities that maintained cultural identity and values despite extreme survival challenges, learning how essential cultural elements can be preserved even when circumstances require dramatic adaptation and change. The cultural continuity demonstrated in Greenland provides models for maintaining community identity during crisis periods. The story of Viking survival in Greenland has transcended its historical origins to become a permanent part of human cultural memory, serving as a symbol of human resilience, community cooperation, and the relationship between civilization and natural forces that resonates across cultures and centuries. The survival narrative has evolved beyond factual history into archetypal story that speaks to universal human experiences of facing overwhelming challenges, depending on community support, and finding strength to persevere when circumstances seem hopeless. Literature and storytelling traditions around the world include survival narratives that echo the themes and challenges of the Greenland Viking experience, demonstrating the universal appeal of stories about human endurance, community cooperation, and triumph over extreme adversity. These stories serve psychological and cultural functions that go beyond entertainment, providing models for courage, resilience, and community cooperation that inspire people facing their own challenges. Popular culture representations of survival situations, from adventure movies to reality television shows to video games, draw heavily on the archetypal elements of the Greenland survival experience. Extreme environment, limited resources, community cooperation requirements, and psychological challenges that test human character and capabilities. These modern representations demonstrate the continuing fascination with survival themes and their relevance to contemporary audiences. Educational curricula in history, geography, anthropology, and environmental science use the Greenland Viking experience as a case study in human adaptation, community development, and environmental interaction that illustrates broader principles about human society and environmental relationships. The historical example provides concrete illustration of abstract concepts that students can understand and remember more effectively than theoretical explanations. Motivational and inspirational literature frequently references historical survival stories like the Greenland Viking experience as examples of human potential for overcoming obstacles, developing resilience, and achieving goals that initially seem impossible. These references demonstrate the continuing power of survival narratives to inspire personal growth and achievement in people facing their own challenges. Cultural discussions about community cooperation, environmental responsibility, and social resilience often reference historical survival communities as examples of successful adaptation to challenging conditions using cooperation, resource conservation, and long-term thinking, rather than technological solutions or individual competition. The Greenland experience provides models for community values and social organization that remain relevant to modern social challenges. Philosophical and spiritual traditions incorporate survival narratives as metaphors for human spiritual development, personal growth, and the relationship between individual identity and community responsibility. The Viking survival experience provides symbolic content for discussions about courage, sacrifice, community service, and finding meaning in difficult circumstances that speaks to universal human concerns. Artistic expression in visual arts, music, and performance often draws on survival themes and imagery that reference the archetypal elements of stories like the Greenland Viking experience. These artistic works demonstrate the continuing emotional and symbolic power of survival narratives to communicate themes about human nature, community relationships, and the relationship between humans and natural environment. National and cultural identity formation sometimes incorporates historical survival stories as foundational narratives that define community values, cultural character, and national identity. The survival experience becomes part of collective memory that influences how communities understand themselves and their capabilities for facing future challenges. International cooperation and global problem-solving discussions sometimes reference historical examples of successful community cooperation under extreme conditions as models for addressing global challenges that require cooperation, resource sharing, and long-term thinking. The Greenland survival experience provides examples of successful cooperation that transcend cultural and individual differences. Personal life philosophy and individual decision-making often incorporate lessons learned from historical survival. Stories as guidance for approaching personal challenges, making difficult decisions, and maintaining hope and persistence during difficult periods. The Viking survival experience provides inspiration and practical wisdom that individuals can apply to their own life challenges and goals. The continuing relevance of the Greenland Viking survival story demonstrates that some human experiences transcend their historical context to become permanent parts of human cultural memory, providing inspiration, guidance, and wisdom that remains meaningful across centuries and cultures. The story survives because it speaks to fundamental aspects of human nature and human potential that remain constant despite changes in technology, society, and living conditions. As winter winds still howl across Greenland's icy landscape, carrying whispers of those who came before, we're reminded that survival isn't just about enduring hardship. It's about discovering the strength we never knew we possessed, the communities that sustain us, and the resilience that defines our humanity. In a world that often feels comfortable and predictable, these ancient lessons about courage, cooperation, and the will to survive remain as relevant as ever, frozen in time but eternally warm in the hearts of those who refuse to surrender to the storms life brings our way.